So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Nabila Hassaf, and I'm a manager in the Fragility Conflict and Violence Group. And it's our pleasure to be here to host this event with the GFDRR. Just want to let you know that Niels won't be able to join us later on. It will be Zoe standing in for him from the GFDRR due to a conflict. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you may be, and welcome to this webinar on the latest El Niño projections and seasonal forecasts. We have a really great group of speakers on this today. We'll first hear from Andrew. Andrew, I'm going to probably butcher your last name. I was going with Kruxiewicz, but I don't know. Tell me the right way to say it. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. Thank you. No, that's fine. I mean, the appropriate way is Kruczkiewicz.
Kruczkiewicz. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So Andrew joins us from Columbia University's International Research Institute for Climate and Society about the science behind El Niño forecasts and the latest projections. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. Then we have Shireen Mirola. She's with the Anticipatory Action Country Support Lead. She's Anticipatory Action Country Support Lead at the World Food Program. And Shireen will talk to us about how the World Food Program uses seasonal forecasts to inform the anticipatory action work that they do and how they are currently preparing based on the current El Niño projections. And then we'll hear interventions from a few World Bank colleagues, including Christina Svensson, the country manager for Somalia, Stephen Halligat, the bank's senior climate change advisor, Federica Rangieri, the Sustainable Development Program lead for Egypt, Yemen, and Djibouti. And thank you all for being here. And as I mentioned, thank you, Zoe, for stepping in for Niels as well. So we very much look forward to hearing all of these different perspectives on what the El Niño impacts might be on our clients and the people of those countries, and many of which are already grappling with multiple ongoing crises. And this aspect of the compounding effects of these different types of crises and stressors is really where we spend a lot of our time and attention in the FCV group under the Global Crisis Risk platform. So that's why we've organized this seminar or webinar under the GCRP with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the GFDRR. And there's this area of mutual interest when it comes to these compounding risks. So the webinar is part of the ongoing work that we're doing to try to understand how these compounding risks affect our clients, and especially FCV affected countries, since countries affected by FCV tend to have much less coping capacity, as well as the exacerbating effects that can occur between these different types of risks and stressors. So one of the reasons that we pay particular attention to climate-related impacts is the vulnerability of FCV countries to climate-related impacts. Of the 25 countries that are considered most at risk for these impacts, 15 of those countries are also on the World Bank's FCS list. For those of you familiar with the list, that's a pretty narrow definition of countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. So the reality is actually a much broader overlap between these two types of risks. In addition, 3/4 of the countries facing acute food insecurity in 2023 are also on the World Bank's FCS list. So this confluence of all of these different types of challenges is naturally of interest and concern. The IMF estimates that GDP losses due to climate shocks are more severe and persistent in FCS countries than in other countries. So that's another factor. The socioeconomic impacts of crises can in turn further exacerbate drivers of FCV. So planning ahead and working to improve the way we prepare and manage crises is really important, and hence the focus of crisis preparedness under the GCRP, and why this webinar sits under the crisis preparedness program in the GCRP. Anna really has been repeatedly making a point in her town halls and many other meetings that we very much subscribe to in the GCRP program and in the FCV group, that we need to stop thinking of crises as shocks, as unexpected shocks, and we just need to start considering them expected and starting to plan for them. So I think that's really at the heart of the preparedness agenda. So the webinar is a contribution to the overall institutional awareness on some of these risks and how our clients are likely to face these risks in the upcoming winter. While using El Nino projections and forecasts to inform decision-making is not straightforward and it comes with many caveats, we need to be aware of these trends so that we can be more forward-looking. So with that, I'll hand over to Andrew, and Andrew will walk us through, well, what is El Nino? I was actually going to ask what is probably for this audience an ignorant question, because when I saw this, I thought, wait, I thought we just did an El Nino webinar. Has that much time already passed? And I was trying to remember what year it was. We actually did the last one. Bianca, can you tell me? Because I feel it was very recent. Time flies.
So it was 2020 and it was El Niño. It wasn't El Nino. So
Okay.
Andrew will remind us
Andrew,
what the difference is.
you're going to enlighten us because I'm very ill-informed. So you'll let us know what is El Nino, what are the latest impacts and forecasts and seasonal impacts across the regions, and what you think it might mean for our operations in the coming months. Over to you.
You're muted,
Andrew, you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much, Nabila. So Bianca, in all, will you share the PowerPoint or should I do it?
If you go ahead and do it if you want, or if I can pull it up in the meantime, in case you have any issues.
Okay, let me see. Actually, maybe if you could pull it up, it would be best, if possible.
Sure. No problem. I'm opening it now.
Anyways, I think I could start though, because I have a couple of reactions or reflections already. No, but thanks so much for the opportunity. I mean, I've been here at Columbia University. I am a meteorologist by training, now working more on seasonal climate and longer term climate. But really, a lot of the work that we do here at IRI is understanding or trying to better understand the cross timescale relationship of climate drivers, climate impacts, the physical processes, and then in collaborate with partners who could help us translate the science into information that could be useful. Okay, I think this is working. No. Okay.
Yes,
great.
It's up.
But I can't click, so I'll have to point for to move them along. But anyway, so a lot of the work we do these days is, yes, on the forecasting side. So in terms of the modeling and in terms of trying to understand what is the best type of ENSO related or El Nino related forecast data for our partners, but also the translation side of it as well. There's a lot of data out there, and in many cases, there's too little time to really parse out what is the best, what is the most appropriate, what is the highest quality, what data do you trust? I mean, these are all context-specific questions to address. So yes, I'm here to unpack a bit of what is ENSO, what do we mean by ENSO, what do we mean by El Nino, what is the current state of the atmosphere and the climate state. But a lot of the suggestions really come from the partnership, from a strong collaborative effort, and much more on that translation side for us to better understand what types of forecasts are useful for our partners and our clients. But then how does that help us improve the way that we present the data and make it more useful? So that's really our mission here at IRI, at Columbia University's Climate School is now what we're part of here. Okay, next slide. So ENSO, I figured we start at the top. There's a few layers here. So ENSO is a term that refers to El Nino and Southern Oscillation. And I'll be honest, it's not my favorite term, ENSO, because I feel like it misses some of the key elements of what we're talking about here. But I took this from the National Weather Service here in the US. What are El Nino and La Nina? So they're opposite patterns of a natural climate pattern across the tropical Pacific, specifically the eastern equatorial Pacific. We've referred to El Nino in the Southern Oscillation, this term ENSO. It was developed back in the late 1980s to characterize this eastern equatorial change, evolution, natural processes in sea surface temperature, but then also the Southern Oscillation element notes that there is more to El Nino and La Nina than just the sea surface temperatures. Sometimes you may hear, oh, when we have El Nino, that means the Pacific Ocean is warming. When we have La Nina, that means the Pacific Ocean is cooling. Well, those are incomplete statements. When we're talking from a scientific and climate perspective of what is El Nino and what is La Nina, yes, we're talking about the shifts in sea surface temperature, but we're also talking about the shifts underneath the ocean. And we're also talking about the shifts in the atmosphere above the ocean. When we have these coupled processes, that is really what drives a lot of the changes that we see globally. And that's one of the key messages here. When El Nino or La Nina is occurring, there's actually enhanced predictability in the climate system. So if we're talking about making forecasts about what precipitation might look like in the next few months, above average or below average, for example, we could always make forecasts if there's El Nino or not. But when we have El Nino and when we have La Nina, this adds to the predictability in the climate system. So it's an opportunity to take advantage of the forecast that we routinely make on the seasonal timescale. And that's an important part. So I feel like a lot of the media coverage, at the very least, sometimes is very doom and gloom around El Nino and La Nina. El Nino is causing floods, it's causing droughts. And yes, we do see shifts globally, of where we might see hotspots or higher risk of floods or drought. But there's also an opportunity here to take advantage of the forecast with this enhanced predictability. So ENSO, whenever you hear that term, that refers to El Nino Southern Oscillation. But actually, ENSO refers to this the state of the eastern equatorial Pacific, what's going on underneath the ocean, and then also what's going on above the ocean in the atmosphere. Those three elements all have to couple and talk to each other and collaborate in order for us to see many of the large-scale shifts in the climate system globally. And we'll go through a couple of those in a few minutes, actually. Okay, next slide. So this is just another diagram about what we mean. Well, that's okay. This is on the right side. This is just another diagram about what we're talking about in terms of what's happening on the sea surface impacts the atmosphere as well. So that's a little more technical. Let's move on. So La Nina and El Nino impacts. ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, yes, and that captures these climate shifts over the Pacific. As we said, we have El Nino, which is that top graph there on the left-hand side where we see some reds and yellows and some blues to the bottom right. So what we're looking at there is the equatorial Pacific. That's a snapshot of the equatorial Pacific. On the right-hand side, we see South America and Central America. And on the left-hand side, we see Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and a little bit of Australia there. And those colors indicate an above average condition of sea surface temperatures. That's what that map is showing us. That's what we call the start or one element of El Nino conditions, the warming of the equatorial Pacific on the sea surface that also is happening in relationship to these atmospheric and then also these below sea surface conditions. That's different from La Nina. If you look below, this is La Nina, so this is what we've had in the last couple of years. We had a relative cooling, so below average sea surface temperatures that occurred relative to different types of shifts in the atmosphere and different types of shifts below the surface. But this is a very common representation of El Nino versus La Nina. And to some extent, it is a partial description of El Nino and La Nina. But I think for this webinar, it's a good first order takeaway. El Nino, one of the key elements is anomalous warming in the eastern equatorial Pacific. And La Nina, the difference there is the anomalous cooling in the eastern equatorial Pacific. And these lead to changes globally, which we see in the second slide here. So when we have El Nino, when we have La Nina, that leads to global impacts on weather conditions in various locations, not only in the eastern equatorial Pacific, not only in South America or parts of Asia, but we see what we call these teleconnections, these ripple effects in different parts of the world. And we'll get to a few of those later. But these maps here are indicative of the typical shifts we see in rainfall patterns when we have El Niño conditions and when we have La Niña conditions. And these maps are produced by us here at IRI based on years of historical data. So they answer the question, when we saw El Niño in the past, where did we typically see shifts in rainfall patterns, and what months did we typically see those shifts in? And then that bottom map is the same question for La Niña. When we had historical La Niña events, where did we typically see shifts in rainfall patterns, and in what months did we see those shifts? It's all freely available as well on their website. But then there's another step here, and this is really where we look to you all and our partners to better understand the impacts on society. You know, there's a lot of talk about El Niño causing damages and leading to changes in distribution of disasters, floods and drought, for example, health consequences. But we know that these systems are complex, you know, and this is something that in my work with the bank have become much more interested in, and also just better informed to hear how our forecasts are potentially useful, but also potentially not useful. You know, that's one of my, I shouldn't say most interesting, but it's a very valuable part of my work as an applied scientist. Just the moments of understanding where the data is not very useful to inform decision-making or policy. And that's important information for us to know as well. So these are some of the causal chains here, and I think we'll talk a little bit about these later, and I look forward to hearing from you all about this as well. Next slide, please. So instead of the typical toolkit, actually, I think a slide was skipped here. If we could go back. Yes, so instead of the typical toolkit, I thought of a more let's say, practical framing. And putting them on a whiteboard, you know, many times, and this is something that I've been part of in my work with the humanitarian sector, for example, is many times there's a lot of data, there's a lot of maps, and we have to talk about which ones are most useful for the different use cases. So here's our ENZO whiteboard. Let's see what we would put on here. Let's see the first slide. Okay, so this is the first piece, the first element in the ENZO whiteboard is the seasonal climate forecast. So on the left-hand side here, we see the IRI multi-model probability forecast for precipitation for December, January, February 2024, issued November 2023. So this is hot off the press, issued, I think, last week. And you see some colors here on the map. You see some greens into blues. You see some yellows into the deeper browns. And these are areas where the forecast is indicating an increased likelihood of either above normal precipitation or below normal precipitation. So, for example, in northern South America, we see the yellow into browns. The darker the brown, that means there's a higher likelihood of that area seeing below average precipitation for the target period, which is the December, January, February 2024. On the other hand, we see greens into blues, and we will touch on East Africa later, but let's highlight a different area, parts of, let's say, East Asia. There's some darker green in Eastern China, for example. These are areas where we're seeing increased risk for above normal precipitation for the period December, January, February 2024. Now, is this a drought forecast? Is this a flood forecast? These are questions we get quite frequently. And the answer in short is no, not really. I mean, this could be one element that feeds into an analysis around how risk is shifting for drought or flood, perhaps. But this is not meant to, the intention is not to take this off the shelf or off the whiteboard and use this as a flood forecast and drought forecast. That's not what it's developed for. Next slide, please. So the next item on the ENZO whiteboard here is what we call the plume. This is something produced by IRI, and this shows the model predictions of ENZO from November 2023 moving forward in time. So on the x-axis here, we see both observed ENZO anomalies. The way ENZO is measured is in what we call Niño 3.4 SST anomaly. Basically, this means this is a way to measure that deviation in sea surface temperature in the eastern equatorial Pacific. When we have above normal, think about the map I showed before with the reds, higher than average sea surface temperature in the Pacific. That leads to an above average sea surface temperature anomaly. So we'll see that above the 0.0 value here on the y-axis. And then below values would indicate La Nina conditions, below average sea surface temperature conditions. On the x-axis here at the origin, we see ASO, that stands for August, September, October. And then we see October, and then we see OND. That's October, November, December. So this is the observed period of time. So we put this in the graph to show what has El Nino in this case done over the past couple months. So we see in August, September, October, we were at 1.5, which is a moderate El Nino. And then we've seen it increase in strength over the past month. And then we see the plume moving forward. So this is the forecast looking ahead. That answers the question, what may happen with El Nino in the coming months. So if we look here at NDJ, which is on the x-axis, and you follow it up where we start to see the colorful points here on the plume, these are the different model forecasts of where we might be with El Nino conditions when we average El Nino conditions over NDJ. So it's November, December, January, but the way we look at that is that we average 3 months to come up with one data point. And most of the models agree that we're going to maintain moderate El Nino. There's some models, some of these up towards the 2 and 2.5 indicate an increase in strength to a strong El Nino. But all the most important takeaway here is that all of the models are showing a plateau over the next couple of months. A plateau in the strength of El Nino, and then a gradual, some of them are showing us a steep decline, but overall averaging the dynamical and statistical models. These are different types of models with different biases, but they're all showing a decline in El Nino conditions. And actually, most of them, if we look at the averages here over MJJ and JJA, those are clusters of months, May, June, July, and June, July, August, we're seeing many of the models indicating near average conditions. So moving away from El Nino towards the next Northern Hemisphere summer, more towards neutral conditions. So not towards La Nina necessarily, but back to a period of neutral conditions, normal conditions in that Eastern Equatorial Pacific area. And that's important. That's important for a few reasons. One, well, we've had El Nino for some months now, and we're starting to see some of those canonical impacts. The increased rainfall in some areas, the decreased rainfall in other areas. However, it doesn't, just because we're moving back towards neutral conditions doesn't mean we're going to see a flipping the switch and then the impacts stop. There is inertia in the systems. There's also other things happening as well. I mean, El Nino and La Nina aren't the only things that happen on these natural cycles on a global scale. We have Indian Ocean Dipole, for example, which is another one of these oscillations in large bodies of water that influence climate both locally and regionally. So there's a lot happening. Sometimes the interpretation of this is, oh, well, next Northern Hemisphere summer, we should be fine. No more El Nino-like impacts. And it's not fully the case. Again, these are these are tools, these are maps that are on the whiteboard, and they need to be appropriately parsed out and interpreted. But that's also what we're here for, to help walk through these and talk about the constraints and also opportunities of using these. Next map, please. Yes. So this is the IRI model-based probabilistic ENSO forecast. This is taking the plume and essentially producing the data or representing the data in different ways that, from our experience working with different organizations, we've had very positive feedback that this is more useful than the plume to answer certain questions. So again, this plot answers the question, in the coming seasons, when we call seasons, we're referring to 3-month periods in the future. For each of those 3-month periods, what is the probability we will see La Nina conditions? What is the probability we will see El Nino conditions? And what is the probability we will see neutral conditions? So if we look to the left-hand side here towards the origin of this plot, we see NDJ, so that's November, December, January, essentially now. And the probability of El Nino is very high, 100%, near 100%. The probability of neutral is not even indicated there, so 0, and La Nina is 0. And that makes sense because we're in a La Nina and it is expected to persist. But as we move forward in time, things get a bit more interesting. Let's look at what should I highlight here? Well, let's start with April, May, June. So here we still see El Nino forecast as the dominant phase. And we see approximately 60, just under 60%, 58% chance of El Nino still in that April, May, June period. However, something is changing here. We're starting to see an increase in the probability of neutral conditions. We're seeing just over 42%, and there's some margin of error there. But still, that is an important data point. That's something that we're looking at to answer the question, when might we see this pivot from El Nino conditions moving into neutral? And then as we move forward, actually May, June, July, we're seeing a shift in the dominant dominant category there, where neutral is forecast to be most likely. And then it gets even more interesting as we get towards, let's say, July, August, September, where we're actually seeing greater chances for La Nina when compared to El Nino. So again, we still need to be careful in the way we represent this. We have something called the spring predictability barrier, which in climate science or seasonal forecasting is the period of approximately in between April, May, June. And historically, we have lower skill in making forecasts of El Nino, La Nina, essentially ENSO forecasts during that period. So personally, I would be very careful using those May, June, July, August forecasts. But it tells us something. It definitely says there's something changing. The models are picking up on this shift away from El Nino into a more, let's say, questionable category or phase. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. Next slide, please. Okay, so the key messages here. El Nino is here. El Nino is still influencing conditions globally. There are other climate factors involved, such as Indian Ocean dipole, so we need to keep that in mind. But these beg key questions. Will this be a strong El Nino? Does a strong El Nino mean strong impacts? What are the expected El Nino impacts? Will we see all of the expected El Nino impacts? Essentially, is every El Nino the same, or how do El Ninos evolve? I mean, this. I was reflecting on the introduction when the comment of in preparedness and anticipation of disasters, it's not about unexpected anymore. And I really appreciated that comment. However, some elements of El Nino are still unexpected. How will they evolve? How will they peak in intensity? We know that El Nino is here. We know that it will persist, but there's many elements of it that still have quite high uncertainty. So we need to be cautious when we're talking about, yes, there are elements that we do know that are not unexpected, but there's other elements of the evolution that there's still many question marks. So on the right-hand side here, I took 2 snapshots. So this is another important point. Perhaps there are some people on this call saying, well, I think I remember a time a couple months ago when there was questions of if El Nino is even happening. There were some people said it was happening. The media, this newspaper said it was happening. This newspaper said not quite. Like, what was that all about? And so I will say this is one of the most confusing parts of El Nino forecasting, and it's something that we're actually trying to change. But yeah, right now there are global centers that produce forecasts, and there are various thresholds or criteria to declare if an El Nino is happening. One of the biggest, 2 of the examples that we use are the National Weather Service, so NOAA here in the US. We have our own criteria. Here's a snapshot from yesterday where it says ENSO alert system status, El Nino advisory. So that's basically saying we've reached a critical threshold, and the US government is saying we're in an El Nino advisory period, and here's some additional information. But on the bottom, this is from the Australian government, from the Bureau of Meteorology. They have a different categorization, classification process, different thresholds. And I'm not going into which one is right or wrong at all. But just so everyone knows, this happens maybe not quite often, but this year was a case where using the criteria put forth by the U.S. government, NOAA, we reached the El Nino status earlier. And it took an extra, I believe, month or so for the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, which many countries in interest in the Pacific will pay attention to, that thresholds were not crossed, I think, until approximately September. So this happens, and it's something to be aware of. Again, going into right or wrong or best, maybe is not the best discussion now, but it's definitely something to flag. Next slide, please. So what can we expect? And I know we only have a couple of minutes left. So this is a map of what we can expect. This answers the question, when we see El Nino conditions, where do we see the shifts globally? So I'm not going into detail here, but this product is available online, and I'm happy to answer questions offline about this. Next slide. Some areas to highlight, and again, I think this will come out in the discussion later on. So this is the seasonal climate forecast. What is happening now? What do the forecast models say now with the data we have in November for December, January, February? In East Africa and the Greater Horn, we are still seeing that forecast, that signal for above average precipitation. So this is definitely something to be aware of if you have work and interest in that region, but I think we'll get into this a bit later. Next slide. And then another area of interest too, we're seeing these deeper greens on this map, which indicate an above average chance for above normal precipitation also in parts of Western Asia, in Southern Asia as well. Next slide. So I think we'll leave it here. And this is just some of the work that I've done with the bank before, is thinking about seasonal climate risk as a compound driver. And this was also suggested in the introduction, which I appreciate. So yeah, just saying that this is something that we're trying to figure out how to improve our modeling. You know, there's still a lot of uncertainty when we're talking about the coupling, not only of the different physical processes, but of course with the socioeconomic processes as well. So we look to improving the way that we build these types of models to get a better sense of, yeah, where can we say that we have confidence, not only in the shifts in the climate element, but also bringing in the socioeconomic change where it is so critical to do so, especially in fragile contexts and in humanitarian settings, and where humanitarian action is taking place. So it's definitely something on our radar, and I look forward to discussing this further as well. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Back to, I'm not sure who, but yeah, over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really fascinating. I have so many questions myself, but of course we'll wait for the Q&A. But I found really compelling this point that you made about, although it implies certain climate patterns and potential impacts, it also brings with it some greater predictability, which is a really interesting point for those working on crisis preparedness. So with that thought in mind, I want to turn to Shireen to talk about how WFP uses this type of information in their own anticipatory action. So over to you, Shireen.
You're on mute, Shireen.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So no, thank you very much for inviting me to present today. I will give you a bit more of the practical application of what Andrew presented from WFP's side, and I will focus mostly on Africa, just because it's been our key intervention location this year. But we've had some other smaller scale activations in Latin Asia, but again, smaller scale than what we've done in Africa. So just to give you a bit of background, anticipatory action is essentially defined as acting ahead of predicted hazards or extreme weather events to prevent or reduce acute humanitarian impacts before they happen. So it's really about linking forecast triggers and thresholds with pre-arranged financing and to implement pre-agreed actions before the hazard hits, and definitely before the hazard impacts are felt by people on the ground. So yeah, really those three pillars are necessary: the forecasts, the actions, and the available funding ahead of any extreme event that we can forecast. And the background to this is really anticipatory action is trying to bridge a gap between preparedness and response. We've seen there's a critical window that previous to anticipatory action was missed. And so this is really what we're trying to achieve, to really act in that critical timeline. And aside from providing a more dignified approach, because of course, if you're thinking from someone who is affected by these impacts, you would prefer having assistance before so that you can take your own preventive and protective action rather than wait for assistance to come later. We've also seen that anticipatory action does have cost efficiency. So around the world, we have studies showing that the benefits of anticipatory action range from, $34 for a savings for every dollar invested in anticipatory action compared to traditional response. And this figure ranges a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the different contexts. Just to give you also a bit of global perspective, we, as WFP, we have a growing anticipatory action portfolio. This map is actually from 2022. The new one is being updated with more colored countries, particularly, I would say, in Latin America and Asia. But just to say, our official stats from last year, we've reached over, I think, 28 countries, covering over 3 million people, meaning 3 million people were eligible to receive assistance if a forecast trigger was reached. And we had about $50 million pre-positioned to support those activations worldwide. Yes. Now, just to bring back to the slides for this year, sorry, we were expecting an El Niño event from, I think, very early this year, and we took some practical actions to address that. So I think internally, first thing we did was also financial planning. So we have a trust fund in our headquarters where we pool all the anticipatory action contributions, and basically at the beginning of the year we plan based on these forecasts when available to prioritize the different regions depending on where we are ready to activate. So for instance, in this year we were ready to activate for drought and floods in Africa. So a lot of our focus was there, our prioritization was there. To give you some examples, so in Somalia, this year we just to go a step back. When we do anticipatory action programs, we really talk about two aspects. So one aspect is all the work, the building part, so really creating the anticipatory action system, which means understanding what forecasts are useful for predicting whatever extreme event we want to focus on. It's about understanding how those forecasts translate into impacts as much as possible. It's understanding what actions can be taken at the local level to mitigate those impacts. Who are we targeting? And this is done ahead of any event, which is very important. And also, of course, the budget implications and the M&E setup. So that's one part, and this is done very much in consultation with governments, so different stakeholders. We bring to the table the meteorologists, but also different response actors, whether it's the social protection ministries or the agricultural ministries, etc. And then on the other side of the spectrum is the actual activation. So if there is, all the prep work has done and there is a forecast alerting us that something will happen, then we are able to implement the plan that we have agreed with those partners. So in Somalia this year, to let you know, the Somalia Disaster Management Authority led a flood anticipatory action protocol across all the different stakeholders in country working on anticipatory action, and basically they defined, what level of risks are we going to cover with flood, who is going to do what, where, and for whom. And it so happened that the forecast trigger threshold for flood was reached, the first one in early October this year. And WFP was able to provide assistance to over 200,000 people ahead of the flood peak. Two things on that. So the first thing, the type of assistance that we provided was, first of all, dissemination of early warning messages and tailored advisories. So communicating to people that this is likely to happen and some advice on how to cope with it or prepare for it. And then we also distributed cash transfers ahead of the flood impact. For you to know, we were able to reach people a couple of days before the actual flood event, which is normal because, as Andrew can provide a much more sophisticated explanation, for floods, it's much more difficult to forecast a lot in advance. So really, we've seen that the longest time frame that we can have, or lead time, before a flood event and still have like an accurate or skillful forecast is usually about 1 week, if we're lucky. And in Sudan, that was in Somalia, this was the case. So we had a 1 week lead time, and we were able to reach people 2 days before the actual first flood event in Somalia. To give you totally different perspective, in Southern Africa, we actually saw El Niño obviously predicting below average rainfall conditions in the region. We supplement that ENSO forecast with seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasts that are also done at national and subnational levels. So we were able to, we were able to have a first alert around July this year, and we were able to implement actions around August to September to protect the people before the main season. So if you're looking at the rainfall season, this is usually from October to March, is a very long season, and the idea of preventing planting reduction and harvesting, and therefore in the long term also lean season impacts. The way we do drought is a bit of a phased approach, especially in a context like Southern Africa, that have a very long season. So we do break up the season into different windows, and we phase our interventions throughout the season as the forecast becomes more accurate the closer we get to the event. But for now, I can say we activated in 4 countries in Southern Africa, so Madagascar, Mozambique, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe. And we were able to reach 550,000 people with different type of interventions. To cluster them, most of the actions were, again, dissemination of early warning information and tailored advisories, some rehabilitation of water infrastructure or irrigation systems, distribution of drought-tolerant inputs, and again, anticipatory cash transfers to help people cope and prepare for a potential, poor harvest and everything that comes with that. Yes, so just to give you a more detailed breakdown of each country. So as you see, Mozambique, we were probably the most people that we were able to reach. And I will give you a bit more information on this because it's quite a nice case study, the Mozambique one. But again, Madagascar, we were really focused on the southern part of the country, which is already quite an a semi-arid region, so any really variability in rainfall is critical. Zimbabwe and Lesotho also triggered, as I mentioned. So what's interesting about Mozambique? Well, two things. So Mozambique has had a very interesting anticipatory action journey. We've really worked hand in hand with the government from the very early stages. In 2020, we started this. And, we've worked with the meteorological services so that they are now able to generate the forecasts for drought and develop the alerts and communicate if an activation is coming to all stakeholders concerned. We also worked with the government to develop the government anticipatory action plan for drought. So this is part of their national contingency plan. And very interesting, the government has now the mandate or the policy framework to be able to allocate financial resources for anticipatory action from its own budget. So now the next step will be to really revise the disaster management fund manual to make sure that those allocations can be done, and also in the timing that we need, which, as you may understand by now, is quite quick. We're talking months. So this year they did so as I said, Mozambique activated. So part of the activation was done directly by WFP. So the early warning information and also the distribution of drought-tolerant input, we are doing this jointly with FAO. But there are also a lot of government-led anticipatory actions that are being implemented by them, including the cash transfers, which are done through the vertical and horizontal scale-up of the National Social Protection Program, and also nutrition sensitization campaigns, as well as other water-related infrastructure rehabilitation work. I think they're also working on some other more agricultural livestock work, for instance, encouraging breeding of small animals which are more drought tolerant. So what's next for anticipatory action? I think one thing to mention is the one thing we're really concerned about is measuring the impact of what we do with anticipatory action. So we really want to show that not only anticipatory action was helpful, but that it is more valuable, or it does provide benefits compared to providing assistance once we know the event has happened and the needs are manifested. So this is where we use a very quasi-experimental, and in some cases a fully fledged impact evaluation. So this will be ongoing at the end of the season. So in Somalia, I think they're already starting with the data collection process, since the peak of the flood has already more or less happened. And in Southern Africa, this will be done once the full season is over, so around April. We're also planning joint after-action reviews at regional levels, particularly in Southern Africa. We want to see different countries, but also different partners, bring them together and go through the entire chain of events. So not only were our actions the right actions to be implemented for this event, but also did our forecast actually predict, did it get it right, essentially? And also were our processes as WFP and as the government and partners conducive to being able to reach the people before the hazard and before the impact. And this will then inform the next phase of planning for the next season. We're also very much focused on multi-sectoral collaboration and anticipatory action. It's a new topic, but one that is gaining a lot of traction, and a lot of partners are involved and starting sometimes the parallel processes. So we're really trying to harmonize and coordinate as much as possible in the different countries and region, and to really focus on scaling up, really avoid duplication and making sure we can build on what is existing and improve what needs to be improving. And I think the other 2 points really is when we're talking about scaling up, is not only obviously covering more people for what is already there. So if we have drought frameworks or if we have flood frameworks, to make sure that we can reach more people collectively with partners. But we also mean scale up in terms of covering different hazards. Of course, that these countries, many of the countries are not only affected by one hazard, but they're affected by multiple hazards. So we really want to be sure to be able to provide that protection across that spectrum. And then the other one is really to focus on, continue focusing on the institutionalization. So on the on the early warning systems and the science part, we're really trying to link anticipatory action work to the early warning for all initiative. But also more generally, just to reinforce the fact that the anticipatory action for WFP is just one pillar of climate risk management. So it's not, a standalone program. It really needs to be integrated with different interventions that cover seasonal chronic needs. And we really try to target, extreme events in a particular time window. And then obviously, if the event happens and it's at the scale beyond what we can cover with anticipatory action, then we have different phases of response with different financing tools, whether it's risk insurance or traditional humanitarian appeals, etc. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions here or even bilaterally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. So we're going to go to our discussants. I'm not going to say that much, but I do think that what you talked about, especially with the government-led action and the multi-stakeholder collaboration, I think is of particular interest, I would say, for those in the bank, given our usual modalities. So I'm going to go straight to Christina. And we had a plan for 5 minutes for each discussant, which would take us to about 10:05. It would leave us only 15 minutes for Q&A. And I do want to hear from the discussant. So what I'm going to strongly suggest is those of you who have questions, start putting them in the chat, because some of the speakers might be able to respond to you directly, or we could follow up, because we don't want to miss out on that opportunity, but we also don't want to miss out from hearing from our discussants. So over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Nabila, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I was driving through Mogadishu today, and some places they used to be just low areas was turned into lakes, and the roads are very, very bad. So first-hand testimony of how the current situation has impacted Somalia. I will just briefly talk a little bit about the impact specifically here in Somalia of the current El Niño, and then I will talk a little bit about our response, and then I think most importantly I'll draw some lessons learned and put some issues for discussion. So first of all, again, since October, the Somalia has been affected by the strong rains due to El Niño, which has led to flooding in most major cities and riverine areas. To date, close to 1.7 million people have been affected and 649,000 have been displaced. I think it's also important in the context of Somalia to point out that this flooding comes on top of a record drought. So we had the worst drought in 40 years over the last 2 years. We had over 8 million people dependent on humanitarian aid, and more than 4.3 million people in severe acute food insecurity. So again, this, as someone said, this is one of these fragile countries that keep being hit over and over again. It's one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world with the least capacity to respond. Then how have we supported the government to respond to this? So again, for the first time, we actually channeled funding on budget, and the government was actually the second largest financier of the drought response. So this was almost 400 million from our side. We reprogrammed resources, we front loaded, we added additional financing, using crisis response window resources. And again, this has enabled the government to take a more operational role in the face of all these shocks. We have also provided longer-term support to the disaster management agency and to build up this forecasting capacity as well and support the dialogue with partners. Through this support, we reached more than 3.9 million people to date. Again, the majority of those funds went through a cash transfer program where we work very closely with WFP. It's called the Bagnano program, and the WFP basically is a subcontractor of the government. So the government signs a financing agreement with us and then an output agreement with WFP, where they have reached to date more than 3.1 million people with cash transfers, an additional 1.3 million people scheduled to receive cash transfers in the context of the floods in the next few weeks. We've also had support under the urban program and under our crisis response program to improve drought-resistant infrastructure, to support IDPs with cash, water, shelter and nutrition services in Mogadishu, Baidoa and Garowe. I think one of the key issues that why we were able to do this and again, was that we were leveraging the current partnerships and existing contracts that we have with UN agencies and NGOs, both local and international, in Somalia. And again, this enabled us to quickly respond and scale up those contracts. As most of you who work in the bank will know, procurement takes a long time. And again, this saved us a lot of time to use these existing contracts. So again, what are the lessons needed? What are the lessons learned? And again, what more is needed? So my first point is that, as you have heard, Somalia is chronically exposed to these kind of disasters, with about a third of the population facing humanitarian needs on average over the last 7 years. And my point here is that we knew that the floods were coming, right? But no one acted. So I realized WFP reached out most likely, but again, everyone was focused on the drought, and the drought was just subsiding. And a lot of local people told us that the floods are coming, and it took us a long time to kind of re-gear, right? And focus on the floods. Not until we had the government declaring a state of emergency did we react in earnest, I would say. This anticipatory action, I think, is a great idea, but I think it's also challenging, because I think donors are really focused on the current crisis, and for them to put resources into anticipatory action at this particular point, when there's so many different crises facing the world, is a very hard sell and hard argument, right? My second point is that we need to react quicker as a bank, right? And this is part of the whole evolution roadmap as well. We in Somalia, we have built up a very shock responsive portfolio, but it still takes us months and up to 6 months to get access to the crisis response window, for example. I'm not blaming anyone, but again, this is the situation. So in addition to accessing the crisis response window, we need to prepare an additional financing and get that through the board. So we actually need to go to the board twice to get access to something that should address a current crisis. So in the last crisis response window, we had actually asked for resources for the drought, and those resources are just now being approved at the board and obviously they will address the flooding, but we need to get quicker. We need to continue investing in systems and prevention in parallel with providing this kind of life-saving support. And this is again under the cash transfer program, which is run by the government and where WFP is working. We have invested in parallel in this unified social registry. We have invested in a digital ID. So again, these kind of system investments are really crucial, I think, especially in a country like Somalia, where the government is so weak, and where we somehow need to put the government back in their role to help coordinate. Then again, we need to find ways. My fourth point is that we need to find ways to pivot towards development. So over the last drought, the last 2 years in Somalia, $3 billion was spent in humanitarian aid. And I think we did some calculation under our education program where building schools all across Somalia would cost about $1.5 billion. So again, I'm not saying that all the humanitarian aid should go to development, but there needs to be some kind of balance and some thinking of how the humanitarian support can provide also investments into systems and into longer term lasting support. Then again, I mean, the message on coordination is essential. We need to coordinate better, right, between the humanitarian and the development community. And finally, I think we need to prepare to take risks. So in these cases, and especially in fragile countries, we need to step out of our comfort zone, right? We need to be quicker. We need to do it on a no regret basis, but we also need to make sure that we, as much as we can, manage the risks. And make sure that the right people are targeted, make sure that the follow-up, the evaluations and everything that the WFP colleague talked about are there. But again, in my mind, there's no doubt that we should have done what we did, right? We should scale up, but we also need to learn how to manage the risks better. So thank you, Nabila, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Christina. Really great points, and so interesting to hear it applied directly to the program Somalia. I think, what you're saying is in order for us to respond better, obviously we have to be prepared more and anticipate better. I'm thinking about the crisis response toolkit that just went to the board and trying to think, is that going to solve some of the problems that you just mentioned? Like, for example, having to go to the board twice, quicker processing through the crisis response window. So maybe that's something for us to think about concretely, almost as a case, and see if it really has everything that we need. But so over to you, Federica, to share with us, your experience on the Egypt, Djibouti, and Yemen program, and how are you actually also working on anticipatory action? And it'd be really interesting to contrast your experience with that on the Somalia program.
Thank you, Nabila, Bianca, Stefan, everyone. Thank you for having me in this conversation. Super interesting, and a big thank you also to the presenters. I reflected on two main points, and I hope it will be useful for the rest of the people in this seminar. So, of the three countries I'm working on, I think that Yemen is clearly the most highlighted at this point, and could be really very well sort of be compared with Somalia. But I also think that Djibouti can offer a lot of points for reflection. So let me start with Yemen. I do agree with all the ideas of these anticipatory actions, and of course, being prepared is always better than responding even at the last second. Unfortunately, FCVs, as Christina was saying, not always allow us for these anticipatory action, or to be able to respond early on and have all the enablers in place. So when we try to figure out what to do with a forecast like El Niño, first of all, we need to say that Yemen is not affected directly by the El Niño. Or not even La Niña, none of the ENSO, but it's very close. So it had experienced a lot of indirect effects out of the El Niño. When we try to figure out what to do with those effects, we first of all try to understand which they were. So out of the 2015, 2016 big El Niño, we had a lot of consequences in Yemen. So as I said, they were indirect. And they were because of, the big storm western winds connected to the El Nino. They brought strong impacts into Yemen. And there's a series of articles that are saying that actually there was a combination of El Nino and these southwestern winds that contributed to the spreading of cholera. So what we could use as a reference to the El Nino in Yemen is actually indirect impacts that were provoked in 2016, and they were extremely high. The level of cholera at the time was extremely high, the highest ever experienced, and there was a list of actions that had to put it to start and were triggers. So that to me is sort of an entry point. So, I mean, that was the way we guided the discussion with the government, or what is left of the governments in there at the time. We started discussing with the international governments. We started discussing with the municipal and the governorate level governments, because a lot of these effects were also at local level. And we try to actually identify the right institutions. So I'm going back to one point that also Christina touched upon. So an enabler for action is not only recognizing that there are impacts, which is what we did with isolating the cholera as an effect, but it's also understanding who are the enablers in terms of institutions that can actually pick it up and do something about it. So in terms of institution in Yemen, as you can imagine, we have very weak institution, borderline non-existent in many of the governorates. We have a split country with a government we are not talking to, and a government that is really very much reducing their ability to respond. So we try to discuss and talk to communities directly, but even there, the enablers are not all there. There's no training. There's difficult to reach out because of security reason, very many of those. So we find ourselves into a difficult situation in understanding who would be actually the implementers. So we keep on working with the UN, we keep on working with the Red Cross and the alike. But we sometimes feel we are not getting to the nitty-gritty of the action. We are not getting to the right people that could be enabled to react. Another point that I think is hard to touch upon are our policies and infrastructure. So we were able to very much invest in infrastructure. Again, as Christina said, no regrets basis, but a lot of infrastructure were reconstructed or rehabilitated. And we were able through the years to do that, adding a resilient perspective. So not just keeping or getting back to the status quo, because it was very clear it was not working conflict-wise and climate-wise. So there was a very good intervention in terms of analytical pieces that guided us in adding a resilience perspective. So all the infrastructure that have been added in the last 3 years have been called resilient infrastructure to the extent possible, but at least we try. There was a big investment also on early warning DRM strategies, all through mainly GFDRR money, but also through other donors. So that brings me to the learning. The learning is extremely important, and it's actually what is kind of guiding any policy reforms. That, to be honest, is not happening now. We don't see any policy reforms right now. We don't even know who to talk to have the policy to be reformed. But we see that there's a shift in attention, and there's a shift on ability to respond to disaster. They see firsthand what's happening in terms of impact, indirect impact, but also they see floods, recurrent floods. It's not El Nino or La Nina, but we have Cyclone Tej that just came in. And we had, I think, rate estimated it's 190 billion. I mean, it's million. It's a lot of money for a country like Yemen of direct impact. We're not talking indirect. So effects are clearly there and seen. So all this to say that if we want to really think about actions and anticipatory action, I think that we really need to focus on institutions and on enabling the right stakeholders to react. And sometimes if institutions are lacking, it should be the communities, the stakeholders. But whatever we are doing, I'm not sure is getting right to the point where it should be. So an open question for our speakers. 30 seconds on Djibouti. Djibouti is right where, you know, the Horn of Africa is, so is one of the least affected by El Nino, but is still very much affected. We have recurrent droughts, we have recurrent floods that are enhanced by El Nino and La Nina when it's their time. So we are expecting to have even more at the end of this year. We had a lot of floods at the beginning. We were completely caught by surprise. So the first thing that it was done was studying with BDNA, so trying to realize what was the level of damage. Now we shifted the narrative a little bit, so there's a lot of preventive actions that are happening at urban level mostly, but again, Djibouti is sort of a state city, so a lot of things are happening at urban level. So there's a lot of analysis on how to build, to reduce the risks of floods. One point that I would like to add, and I close, is about access to finance and insurance in this case. So there are a lot of interesting means at Africa level, the Africa risk capacity, I mean, other facilities. I think there's something also at the Horn of Africa level, but I don't think there's something like Horn of Africa drought facility or Horn of Africa flood response. So just to see if there's thinking about that. So having these financial and insurance instruments, not only at the level of the government, but, you know, trying to get all the way to households, if that's possible. And that might include even cat bonds, which I don't think have ever been included in the Horn of Africa, at least not in Djibouti. We don't know about it. And maybe that at the regional level could be an interesting way to, you know, get some funds and start thinking proactively. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Federica. And I think, you know, between what you talked about in terms of trying to prepare and respond in a context where there are governments where we're not able to work with directly, and what Christina talked about in terms of a government with weak capacity, I think the additional challenges of doing this work in SCV affected countries, I think, is really clear. And thanks for pointing out maybe these opportunities for different types of financial facilities that could be explored more. And I have to say, the link to health risks, I think someone also posted in the chat a similar cholera risk forecasting in Haiti, and I think that's a really important connection on the compounding effects of these types of risks. So with that, over to you, Stefan. I mean, give us your reactions to all this, bigger picture. How do you see this evolving in a context of, you know, the rising challenge of climate change, and also just in terms of these climate impacts, and what parallels do you see with our attempts to respond to these, you know, bigger, longer term patterns and effects, and how we prepare for them? Where do you see the linkages, overlaps, and what can we learn from these two spaces?
Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this event. I think it's really great to have this this conversation. My first reaction is really the progress that we have made in maybe like 10 years, and that's really progress in the predictability. So I mean, what we can do today in terms of anticipating the plume that Andrew showed. I remember a time when this plume was maybe like 3 times as large, and it was making life much more complicated. But what's really striking is not only the progress on this predictability, but also the progress in how we use it. And it's really interesting to just listen to all of these examples where we can move to more proactive, more anticipatory approach. Again, I remember a time when people were just pushing back immediately, saying like, we have so much emergencies all the time. Forecasts are always uncertain. Let's focus on what the crisis we have today, and not try to do more than that. And I think the case that we can be much more efficient, that we can prevent a lot of suffering, and also save a lot of resources by being more proactive and by taking risks. I think that's a term that came a couple of times. I think this argument, which was difficult to make only 10 years ago, has made really huge progress. I was really happy to see that there is M&E embedded in some of those initiatives, because we have great examples here and there, but we're very far from this being the normal way of doing business, right? Having anticipatory action embedded in everything. So the more we can highlight the benefits where this is being implemented, the more we can have this learning taking place. And of course, if the learning also takes place in fragile environment, I think it's even more convincing, right? It shows like it's possible to do even if you don't have all of the infrastructure, all of the resources that you would want to have, but you can still do things. I guess to me, what's really important is the fact that when we get those seasonal forecasts or this anticipation of El Niño or La Niña, I mean, it's in a way it's too late to act until we have prepared way before that. So I think we have this window with a few months, but we can use it only if we spend years before that to put in place the systems and the infrastructure. And I think this is maybe where we still have a case to make, right? That we need to build that system that when we have this 3 months in advance, we can react to it. So I think it's interesting in the context of the evolution roadmap at the bank and the toolkits to think about how we are much more systematic on this to put in place the infrastructure we need. I think Andrew made the case very strongly that this is not a forecast, right? The uncertainty remains super high. It's basically a change in the likelihood of different things. So the management of uncertainty is really key. And I would be really interested in feedback of cases where we have those anticipatory transfers, for instance, and things go okay, right? So how do we manage that situation to explain that, yes, maybe we did not get the bad impact that we expected. It doesn't mean it was a bad idea to do those transfers because the likelihood of an event was there. And so I think we have to have a narrative for that. And I think key is really transparency. So I saw a question in the chats that I would flag about all of the thresholds and the indicator that are used to trigger those responses. I think the more this is transparent and open, the more we can explain why sometimes maybe the transfers might not have been needed, but we still decided to do it because we had good reasons to do that. I think this narrative is absolutely critical. And I think accepting that sometimes we're wrong. So this idea of taking risks, I think is really important to me. I think in those cases, it's very easy to claim that, I mean, the worst case scenario, we're making transfers to very poor people who are not like living in luxury anyway, right? So it's very difficult to say that it was a bad idea, but we know we'll still hear that. So I think, again, being prepared for that is really important. Just to conclude that we have time for the Q&A. One is, what are the other cases where we'll have similar predictability in the future? I think it's be a question to Andrew maybe. So ENSO was always the easiest, but in the West African monsoon, for instance, there is also some predictability. So could we do a better job by using other oscillations or other patterns? And this might be a case where the tropic has an advantage. There's much more predictability over like 3, 4, 6 months than in extra tropical areas. So I think this is something where we should probably push really hard. And to conclude on the toolkit, I think the toolkits, when we have those conversations, we can see we're not really where we would like to be, right? There is a lot more to do. I think having a much more systematic and universal access to contingent financing when something goes wrong or when we have a good prediction that something is likely to go wrong would be really useful. Federica, you mentioned cat bond. I have to say that the cat bonds are really super expensive. I think tools like the cat DDOs and contingent loans economically are much more efficient. So for poor places, it's probably where we want to start. But again, I think we have to really move from those very nice cases that we can talk about to something much more systematic. It needs to be available everywhere all the time, and this change in scale, I think, is really the challenge we have in front of us. But thanks again. I think this is really useful to see those good examples, and looking forward to more on this topic.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And really great points. I think to start the Q&A, I want to Andrew and Shireen, there's some points that were already mentioned by the discussants. And there's also a couple of questions in the chat. So just to highlight some that are in the chat, there's the question that was just mentioned also by Stefan about the triggers and thresholds. That's for the World Food Program for triggering anticipatory action. There was also a question for Andrew, I would imagine, whether El Niño events are becoming more frequent, or if these patterns are changing over time, or if we're seeing the behavior is consistent over time. And then there were some questions on the linkages to the health sector. So I'm going to pass to Andrew first, if you can react to some of the points that were brought up by the discussants and the questions I just mentioned, and then over to Shireen for the same. And meanwhile, we'll see if anybody else puts their hand up to actually ask the question or puts more questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks for thank you to the discussants for all the reflections and reactions. Definitely some points that resonated with me. So I think maybe first I'll react to, or I will elaborate on my response to Sylvia's question. So, and I'm very glad, Sylvia, that you asked this question. It is an area of active research, the relationship between climate change and El Niño or La Niña. Yes, we are not making simplified statements yet about how El Niño will change or has changed. There are many factors, and I think we're being very careful about making statements. And you'll find that in the literature as well. If you're interested in some of the analyses that have been done, there are some that lean towards, let's say, more frequent El Niños or stronger El Niños. But it's not as simple as that, because when we're talking about El Niño or La Niña, we're talking about the gradients that exist, not only at near the surface of the ocean, but below the ocean and also in the atmosphere. So it's hard to kind of decouple these processes and then look at them individually related to climate change. And it's happening. I mean, it's actually not my area of expertise, but there are other people here at Columbia and other places looking at this. So definitely a question we need to do more research on. Specifically on the points that I mentioned here, the duration of El Niño, the impacts, are impacts evolving? Something that comes to mind and that we're more interested in is that map that I showed around historical impacts of El Niño, areas that we think of changes in precipitation, shifts in risk and precipitation with El Niño. Are there areas that may in the future be affected by these teleconnections that are not affected now or haven't been in the past? These are the questions that we're most interested here at IRI. How will the impacts evolve over time due to climate change and or due to other factors? So yeah, and then I also at the end I think it's a really important point. Like, we have a lot of research to do, and scientists are still a bit disincentivized to have substantive relationships with partners, and that needs to change. The research that we're developing to answer some of these questions, we must have it more directly informed by use cases, not only national level agencies, but also, for example, working with the bank. How do we make our research the outputs more applicable? And I think we're getting better at that, but still the incentive structures are not quite there yet. Stefan, thank you for your comments on the plume. First of all, yes, it is nice when the plume is more condensed. I think it helps in some ways. That's not always the case, but yeah, I think right now it's a good moment to have this webinar in thinking about what the future state may be. But again, it's not always like that, and I think. Especially thinking beyond spring, Northern Hemisphere spring next year, we need to keep an eye on things, because this is what we call the spring predictability barrier, and it's that's another discussion about why why there's lower predictability then. And then the other question, I forget what the other point you had, Stefan, about the forecasts.
Well, I was just wondering what in what regions will we have seasonal predictability coming at us to help with agriculture, to help with flood, water management, and so on.
Yes, you mentioned the West African monsoon. That's right. So, yes, I mean, this is another area of active research where we're trying to get better. The seasonal forecast community is trying to get better at integrating, the forecasts of the Indian Ocean dipole, for example, or what's happening in the West African monsoon. I mean, the seasonal forecasts, for example, the one that I showed today, the IRI seasonal forecast, I'll put the link in after I'm done speaking here. That the intention is that captures the various various modes of variability that are happening, that are changing and evolving. So that is not a El Nino forecast or an El Nino informed forecast exclusively. That does address the other processes. However, historically, the way that forecast was kind of tailored and bias corrected was conditioned, let's say, mostly on El Nino or the Southern Oscillation. It's not really the most fair statement, but I mean, this is where we have the most historical research and attention looking at the teleconnections from El Nino. And, we need to do better as well. That is something that we're always trying to do better at. How do we make sure that we appropriately integrate not only the forecast for these different modes of variability, but also their impacts? And that's hard to do because we're dealing with different time scales, we're dealing with different spatial scales. And I mean, but it's also a challenge of why I like to be a scientist, and also always have to make sure that what we're doing at least has a higher likelihood to be useful. So I look to you all for guidance on that as well. I really do. And please, my last statement I'll say is, please help us know what is not working and was not useful. I still feel like a lot of my work is in the humanitarian sector, and it's very hard to get an honest feedback around the forecast or the representation of the data that's really not useful. I've definitely been in cases where I think the forecasts really weren't useful and are potentially distracting. We're in an area where there's a lot of data and really not enough time to translate and parse out what is useful and what is not. So down to like a practical level of decision making, I think this also references or resonates with a bit of what Christina was saying in Somalia. It's hard. We have the forecasts, we have the information, we have people that have a good sense of what might happen. Okay, we don't have the exact evolution, every element about extent or magnitude, fine, but how do we take a step back and look at shifts in risk? And how can we help as scientists to better frame? There's a push towards higher spatial resolution or higher temporal resolution from a scientist perspective, but many times that's not exactly what's most useful and could actually be distracting, because the trade-off of uncertainty that you're bringing into those representations, high spatial resolution, is probably not worth it, I'd say, in terms of the perception or perceived quality of what the forecast is saying there. So those are some additional thoughts. I think I'll hand it off now, but yeah, I'm very happy to elaborate on any of this offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So I want to, we have two things we still need to do. I want to get Shireen's response to the question on the health sector, and just to see if the thresholds or indicators that trigger anticipatory action at WFP are public or available. But we also have Zoe Trahanis from the GFDRR to close, and we're 8 minutes over. So Shireen, as quickly as you can, and then over to Zoe.
Yes, I'll be super quick. So on the forecast triggers and thresholds, just to give a general overview of how it's done, this is usually looking back at the data available. We look at what variables most accurately correlate with the bad years, whether it's flood or drought or whatever, which forecasts are the most precise in having predicted this historically, and for which thresholds or hazard scenario do we want to focus on. And then we basically match the observed data with the forecasts, or in this case, the hindcasts, to assess the forecast scale and the trigger, so the probability of something reaching and deciding whether we act or not, is essentially based on an analysis of a false alarm versus missed events. So if we use this variable, for instance, we can have, looking back 10, 15 years in the past, we would have had this number of false alarms or this number of missed events. And then it's depending on the stakeholder risk appetite to set what is the appropriate level. And this leads me to the other question on how to manage the false alarms. Of course, if you take it year by year, you will always want to actually not act because you don't want any false alarm. But I think the important thing is to recognize that this needs to be seen in a longer term perspective. And actually, when you look over 10, 15, 20 years, the false alarm and missed events will even up. So in the end, you're not risking as much as you would do if you consider it year by year. I hope that makes sense. But the communication around this is very important. That's why the consultation process and the decision making is done with the government at technical and also at political level in many cases. Regarding on the health, and also just to finish on that, we also do these after action reviews in every case, also to reflect on the trigger model and see how good was the forecast performance or how bad and what do we need to improve. And we work very closely with technical service providers, including IRI, but also the UK Met, University of Reading, etc., to work with the governments to improve their own forecasting capacities to be able to do this themselves, because this is really, I think, one distinguishing feature of WFP's anticipatory action programs is that we don't use our forecasting models or some other forecasting models. We really try to work with the governments to develop their capacities on that front. Regarding the health sector, I don't think so far, with the exception of cholera anticipatory action frameworks, which to me personally, they're very much still early response rather than actual anticipatory action in a purest form. I don't think there has been any specific health anticipatory action. It's very much been confined to the wash sector. I think it's very, perhaps with flood, there's a bit more correlation between flood and health. With drought is always a bit tricky to see to what extent, but I think an important thing to consider is also how can anticipatory actions, whatever they are, indirectly contribute to health benefits, whether it's, for instance, ensuring continuity of the health services during the peak shocks. So that's, I would say, is important. And then I think there was a comment on the funding, and I really, it's something that always comes up. But I also think two things. One is we also need to consider the fact that I think about 50% of the humanitarian crises we're seeing today are predictable, and at least 20% are highly predictable and can be forecasted. So there really is a moral, I say, argument to not only focus on what is ongoing, but also try to prevent what is preventable. And then the other point is that I also, from the finance side of things, this argument could be applied to any type of prearranged funding. It could be applied to why are we paying for insurance premiums? Why are we setting aside money for regular contingency funds? At the end of the day, everyone is putting aside some money for some unexpected events. So I don't think anticipatory action is that much different from these cases. The only caveat, of course, is the forecast, but this is where the technical work on making sure that we reduce false alarms as much as possible is important, and that we also look at that longer perspective that I mentioned before and seeing how many false alarms can we afford over 10, 15, 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen, and thanks for making that very strong case for financing prior financing for anticipatory action, which I think is a really good segue to GFDRR in terms of, and Zoe, so please over to you to close us out.
Oh, thanks, Nabila. Thanks, everyone. It's a tough job that I have here to close this. It's been quite a rich discussion over the past hour and a half. I learned quite a bit. And I think from my side, so I am a lead disaster risk management specialist at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and it is a multi-donor trust fund or partnership, and we help low and lower middle income countries better understand and reduce their vulnerability to natural hazards and climate. And so the goal is really to help enable countries to bounce back better and faster from external shocks, right? And so what I heard today from all of you, going from the projections, in terms of what's going to happen with the forecasting to on the ground responses, really, to me, risk reduction is what we need to invest in. Yes, we need to get better at emergency preparedness and response. Yes, we need to do more in early warning systems, but I think Stefan mentioned, it takes years to get to the point where we're investing in systems and infrastructure and other things. And then being able to be prepared across the board is systemic, right? And so that to me is a development effort that goes along, of course, working with humanitarian agencies and other partners when emergencies strike, and also on the preparedness front. But I think the other point is that we've been doing better. And again, Stefan mentioned this. So we did do an evaluation here at the bank of our disaster risk reduction portfolio over the past 10 years. And we found that we went from responding to emergencies and crises to then building in. So now over the past 10 years, we've actually built in risk reduction, emergency preparedness, early warning systems, these types of investments into emergency response and recovery programs. So the boat, if we're on a massive ship as the World Bank, it is turning bit by bit. We're getting there. And we are making progress along with the crisis preparedness toolkit, as well as what we're talking about in the evolution roadmap to try and do more on these fronts and to support our client countries. I think another element that we heard today that is critical is partners, because this is not going to be done alone. And of course, we need to leverage government systems as they exist and where they do, and strengthen capacities from national to local and communities to work on emergency preparedness response, to understand forecasts, to be able to deliver early warning messages, to make sure no one is left behind. But this is not something that the World Bank can do alone, obviously. So partners like the WFP, the scientific community, of course, governments themselves are critical. And then last but not least, I think it's also very important to think through tailored, scalable approaches. We've heard this a lot from President Banga, that in order to go big, going forward, especially with the evolution roadmap for the bank to scale, we need to also understand what can be done, what can be taken forward in scalable ways and repeated in different cases, tailored and repeated. And so how can we do that, as well as capture lessons at the same time to make sure that we're, doing what's right in the context at the time to help ensure that crises when they respond, or crises when they occur, that governments and communities can respond accordingly, as well as the World Bank and other partners. So I think I'll stop there. I know we went way over time. It's tough to wrap up with such a comprehensive program and discussion, but thanks again to everybody for participating and for organizing. And I'm sure, Nabila, there will be future discussions like this going forward. No?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zoe. And I want to thank Andrew, Shireen, Stefan, Federica, Christina, everyone spoke. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Bianca, the GCRP team, the crisis preparedness program, and our SCV knowledge team, Hamza and others, for setting this up. And I want to thank everyone who attended. We went severely over time, and 41 of you stuck it out. So really, thanks for attending. And I think this also, just these kinds of discussions, you get to know the people involved, the faces and so on, and really creates opportunities for, follow-up, collaboration and questions and so on. So I hope you'll all take advantage of that. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.